In this video, I'm going over everything you need to know to start coloring. I'll also go over some of the tools you can use in Clip Studio Paint, but they will also be in almost any other drawing program. We'll start with a general overview of the fundamentals first to refresh them. There are multiple ways to denote a color. The one I'll be using is HSV. HSV stands for Hue Saturation Value. Hue is the simplest. It's the outside ring showing the color. Saturation and value are additives to the color you selected and are shown in the center square. When it comes to coloring though, you can't trust this digital readout to be accurate because color is very context sensitive. Take this blue and yellow for example. Both are fully saturated and should be the same value, which you can see in the color picker that they're both in the top right. But switching to black and white, you can see that their value, how close they are to white, is drastically different. Now take a look at this orange. You might want to take a step back from your screen because this is going to get bright. When I change the value of the background between black and white, you can see how different it looks. Again, the orange square is staying the same, only the background is changing. This is also why you might want a more neutral tone like gray for the background when you color. Even saturation can make or break an image. If you look at these swatches next to each other, it looks fine. Increase the saturation slightly though, and the same swatches start to clash. Increase the saturation further and it gets even worse. The main takeaway from this is to trust your eyes. Sometimes you need to make changes on the fly. You know, granted your display is fairly accurate and not affected by Windows nightlight. All of this might be difficult at first, but in time you'll get the hang of it. I hope this hasn't put you off of learning coloring. Now for how color harmony works. It doesn't get any better from here. I've mapped out the colors I used in the saturation example. As you can see, the colors are very far apart. In itself, this isn't a huge issue if they're used sparingly as accent colors, but each of the 5 colors are used about equally. What that means is there are no swatches that bring the 5 colors together. For example, let's bring 2 colors on the opposite sides of the color wheel together. I chose purple and green. If you look at both the squares for value and saturation together, you'll notice they both contain gray. So if you want to link them together, you can do so through gray. Now let's take a look at the color palette I created. The swatches are placed according to their hue, and how far away from the center they are shows their saturation. The value is not mapped to an axis, but keep in mind that the swatches you're going to use for the shadows are going to be darker. In a color palette, you're most likely not using only 2 hues, so what you can do instead is pull the transition between green and purple through a desaturated light blue instead of gray. With swatches linking purple and green together, they feel a lot more cohesive. All you need to make an image at a bare minimum is light shapes and shadow shapes. What separates good light and shadow shapes from bad ones is that you should still be able to tell what you're looking at, instead of it being an ink blot test. Take a look at this image for example. Even though the individual shapes are very distinct and simple, it's hard to make sense of what you're looking at. There's too much information. Meanwhile, take a look at this image and you can clearly tell it's a funyarimpa.
What the hell is a funyarimpa?
The more you render shadow shapes, the more detailed the shadow shapes become, to the point where just the light and shadow can tell you what the object is. As you can see here with the shorts. Notice how the left side of the shorts is actually multiple shadows grouped into 2 shadow shapes. Now think of your shadows as being either cast shadows or form shadows. Cast shadows are areas where light is being blocked by something. The shape blocking the light will thus be visible in the shadow shape. Form shadows are where the form is turning away from the light. Remember that light travels in straight lines. The more gradual the plane turns away from the light, the softer the edge becomes. Cast shadows are known for their sharper edges and form shadows are known for their softer edges. That doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive though. The larger the distance between the shadow and the object casting the shadow, the more the hard edge turns into a soft edge. What you're aiming for is the contrast between hard edges and soft edges. You can use the Sorrow head to learn how light falls on the planes of the face. Going back to the image, you're reducing the values to light, midtone, and shadow. It's up to you to simplify and stylize. What you want to think about is the silhouette you're gaining and the silhouette you're losing. If you zoom out, the arm and back just blend together because the values are very similar, making it look like it's actually her right arm instead of her left arm. So make sure you zoom out at some points, especially when you're drawing the shadow shapes. Now that we finally have the basics out of the way, we'll actually get to how to color. Before you start, I recommend making a base layer and clean fills for everything you want to separate. You can do this either with foreground, midground, and background elements, or you could do it with individual objects like the shorts, t-shirt, the hair, and the body. This allows you to select what's on a layer so you can use it for a paint over layer or a layer mask. The better you get at rendering, the more helpful this will be, and I will refer to making selections like this later in the video. You can select everything on a layer by holding Ctrl and clicking on the preview showing what's on the layer. You've already separated the base color so you can clean it up quickly. Just hold the Shift key when you Control click on the previews of the layers you want to add to your selection, and to remove layers from your selection, just hold the Alt key instead of the Shift key. So what you can do to clean up the shorts layer is Control click on the shorts layer, and then Control Alt click on the body layer. Now that you have clean layers, you can easily create layer masks by making a selection and pressing this button. They function the same as clipping masks, but they don't have to be above the base layer. This gives you a lot more freedom when you're doing paint overs. Speaking of painting, when you're painting shadows, especially on the skin, make sure you increase the saturation. It might also help to add an arrow showing where the light is coming from as a visual aid. I copied the initial lighting and then added the arrow when I was adjusting it. This helps keep your lighting consistent. To achieve the contrast between hard edges and soft edges, I painted all of my shadows with a hard brush, and then I used the blur tool to soften the edge where it was needed. On the leg, for example, you can see that the more round form of the thigh and calf have a softer edge than the back of the knee, which is more angular. Drawing clothing folds like this is a lot harder when you're starting out because it doesn't give you a good idea of what it will look like. So what you can do is make a new layer on a clipping mask and paint in the shadows. This is also much quicker since it's only using one brush stroke. The light you used is also too close to the value of the midtone, which makes it really hard to see that's even there. So make sure there's enough of a value difference if you want to add in a rim light. You use the blending modes multiply for shadows and screen for light, which is fine, and I recommend you do that when you're starting out so you at least know what it's supposed to look like. But it does tend to tunnel vision you on the colors the blending modes gave me are the limits, and I can only lower the opacity from there. So what you can do to help with that is just duplicating the screen and multiply layers, and experimenting with changing the opacity on all 4 layers. You might find a balance you like more. After you've painted the shadows, one thing you can do to instantly improve your clothing is to lightly airbrush the skin color onto the clothing. Don't overdo this though. You can do something similar to the face as well. I airbrushed some yellow onto the top and bottom of the face that would typically come from reflected light. I also airbrushed some red onto the cheeks where the thinner skin shows more of the blood tone. When you're basically finished, you can make a selection of the base layer by control clicking, see I told you it'd come back, and adding correction layers like tone curve and color balance. You can also do this for specific parts since we cleaned up the layers. The only change I made to the base colors was changing the bottom of the shorts to a gray that you'd find on the inside of denim so they look folded over. And finally, I also made a color dodge layer on low opacity to play up the contrast between warm light and cooler shadows. If you want to do that, make sure to airbrush very saturated and bright colors and then lower the opacity to your liking. I used orange for the light and purple for the shadows. Even though this video is about coloring, I'm deliberately not showing you how to pick colors because there's no right range of colors to use. Being able to pick colors that works for you comes with experience, but what you can do to develop that skill faster is plotting the colors that are used in images you like. But even that takes time, so something that helps right now is when you're coloring your next artwork, find a reference that has the colors you want to emulate and place it next to the canvas while you're coloring. It gives you something to check your colors against. And that should be everything you need to know to start coloring. I probably missed something, so feel free to ask me in the Discord. And yeah, that's it. Good luck with coloring.